Today we're going to learn about the evidence that supports evolution. Feel free to start and stop the video as needed. We'll begin by going over today's agenda. During our instruction today, we will learn about the evidence that supports the theory of evolution on notebook pages 118 and 119, which are packet pages 106 and 109. We will also complete a Nearpod to practice using some of the techniques presented. Here is the link to the Nearpod that is self-paced. So let's get started. Again, we'll use packet page 106, which was placed on notebook page 118, Evidence of Evolution Notes. One of the main evidences we have to support evolution is the fossil record. Remember that a fossil is the remains or traces of a once living thing, from the past. There are two ways to date fossils, something called absolute dating and relative dating. Absolute dating measures radiation, like carbon-14, a radioactive isotope, to get the exact age of the fossil. Whereas in relative dating, here we're going to compare the position of the fossil to estimate the age of it. So we'll look at the fossil's position in sedimentary rock layers. So for example, if we look at these rock layers, this rock layer and everything in it, including the fossils, is going to be older than this layer. These fossils at this rock layer are older than the one above it, etc. so forth. So down here are the oldest fossils. Up here are the newest fossils. We also look at similar body parts to see which organisms are more closely related to who. And we look at something called homologous structures. Homologous structures are body parts made of the same stuff, meaning they're the same on the inside, their internal arrangement, or they're like, for example, in this example, we're looking at the internal bone arrangement of the human, dog. We've also got bird and whale. So when we look at the inside, we can see that all of these organisms have one bone that's tan, that's the humerus, then two bones that run parallel to each other called the radius and the ulna, they're white and red, and then the wrist bones, the carpals, and the metacarpals and the phalanges. So we see the same arrangement. Even though these organisms, their forelimbs have very, very different functions. But since they're the same on the inside, we determine that they share common ancestry and they are closely related. Whereas analogous structures, this is the flip side. These are body parts with the same function, maybe like flight, but they're not made of the same stuff on the inside because they're not very closely related. So for example, if you take the wing of an insect, which is an invertebrate, and the wing of a bat, which is a vertebrate, a mammal, the shape of the wing is very similar, the function is very similar, but the insides are very, very different, indicating that they're not very closely related. Vestigial structures are functionless parts, body parts that are no longer used. For example, in certain species of whales, we still see the femur bone, which is the leg bone, and pelvis, which are hip bones. We also see the same thing in certain species of snakes. Another example of a vestigial structure in humans would be our appendix. It's a functionless part that had a function in a common ancestor. The best evidence to support evolution and to figure out who's more closely related to who is to look at DNA evidence, look at similarities between DNA. So if you look at this chart, you're looking at the ancestral species, the DNA sequence of a jellyfish, panda bear, worm, and pelican, and you're comparing the jellyfish sequence to the ancestral species, the panda bear to the ancestral species, the worm to the ancestral species, and the pelican to the ancestral species. And you're counting the number of differences between the ancestral species and that organism. So I've already done some counting for us. So between the jellyfish and the ancestor, there were 3 differences. The panda bear and the ancestor were 9 differences. The worm and the ancestor, there was 1 difference. And the pelican and the ancestor, there were 8 differences. So who's more closely related to the ancestor? it would be the organism that has the least number of differences. And in this case, there was only one difference between the worm DNA sequence and the ancestor DNA sequence. So the worm is most similar to the ancestor. So the fewer the number of differences, the more closely related the organisms are. The larger the number of differences, the least closely related they are. So down below the picture, the diagram here, I want you to write phylogenetic tree, maybe at the bottom or off to the side. And these trees show how things are related to each other, who's more closely related to who. And we'll get a little bit more practice with this later. So if we put the ancestor down here at the bottom, and we ask ourselves which organism is more closely related to the ancestor, if you go up the tree, you can see it's at this point right here that the shark and the ancestor shared a common ancestor. It would be at this point, so it's further up in time, where the tuna and the ancestor shared common ancestry. So for example, if you were trying to figure out who's more closely related to the whale, which is a mammal, you would go back to see where the point is, which is here. It was at this point in time that the human and the whale shared common ancestry. So again, the shark, to answer the question, is the most similar to the ancestor. Again, DNA is the best evidence to support evolution. Okay, now I would like to switch to my document camera to go over the evidence of evolution foldable. Okay, so remember, this is page 119 in your notebook, or packet page 109. And we've already written our patterns of evolution at the bottom, and so we have our foldable at the top. And it would be a good idea to go in and stop the video and probably go in and draw some lines, so you'll have little boxes underneath, and you can also cut your flaps. Okay, so when we look at the first piece of evidence, which of course are fossils, and we can see that older fossils gradually look more and more like recent fossils. Fossils become more complex over time, and what I mean by that is moving toward recent time. They become more and more complex. As far as the flap for ancient organisms remains, remember that fossils provide evidence that organisms have changed over time. Anatomical similarities. Again, many organisms have similar body plans, and I'm talking about the inside, the internal, for example, bone arrangement. The similarities suggest common ancestry, and what I'm talking about here are homologous structures. This was the forelimb example, the forelimb of the dog and the human and the whale. Again, the best evidence, so I put stars on it, are genetic similarities. So again, the more similar the DNA or the genes, the more closely related the groups of organisms are. And then lastly, we did not go over embryological similarities, looking at how the embryos develop. Again, if you're trying to figure out who's more closely related to who, don't look at what the adult organism looks like. Look at how the embryos develop. Okay, so the closer the embryo's development, the more closely related the organisms are. So the closer their development, again, it means that they're more closely related. So again, these are our flaps on evidence of evolution. Again, you probably needed to stop and start the video as needed. Okay, at this time, I want to go back to the agenda so we can take a look at the link for the Nearpod. So if you go back to the agenda on Monday, 3/15, there is going to be a link that will give you a self-paced Nearpod. You'll join the lesson. And again, we've got evidence for evolution. And what I would like to do is just read this first background information to you, and then I'll let you get on your way. As we have learned, DNA codes for amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Therefore, DNA is the written code for our body's proteins. When studying evolution, scientists predicted that if two organisms are closely related, then they should share many similar DNA sequences. The more closely related an organism is to one another, the more DNA sequences they would share. This means they have a common ancestor that also has these similar DNA sequences. However, if two organisms are distantly related, they share fewer DNA sequences, thus fewer similarities, and therefore do not have a common ancestor, or it's been a really, really long time since they share common ancestry. So there's a protein called cytochrome. Cytochrome is a protein found in our blood. Cytochrome is found in the mitochondrial membrane and helps our cells produce energy during cell respiration. So we use this protein called cytochrome to analyze differences in the amino acid sequences, which again is an indirect way of looking at the DNA. In this investigation, we'll be comparing the amino acid sequence that codes for human cytochrome to the amino acid sequence for cytochrome for other animals. So again, you'll just click on the arrows and then you'll just complete the activities. I hope everyone has a good day. Bye.